Okay.
Great. So yeah, thanks very much for joining, everyone. I think a few of us have been in the previous sessions, but for those who haven't, this is one of 3 sessions as part of the worldwide teach-in on climate and justice, which is organized by Bard University, Bard College and the Open Society University Network. And we have 3 sessions happening here at SOAS, but really engaging with our student body, which is worldwide through a lot of the online and distance learning programs, and anyone else who's here to join us. So welcome, everybody. Today we are going to be talking about enabling just energy transitions, picking up on some of the themes from earlier sessions and certainly some new ones as well. So we've got 4 speakers. First, Christine Oughton is going to talk about catalyzing innovation and income equality to transition to zero carbon. Giuseppina Siciliano is going to talk about renewable energy transitions, equity and justice. Michael Albert on the global politics of just transitions. And then I'm going to have the last presentation on disagreement for climate justice. We're all going to keep to short, pithy 5-minute interventions so that we've got time for discussion and reflecting on the intervention from each of us. But if we would like some prompts for the discussion that follows, we would like to be thinking about what climate justice looks like in relation to each of the topics that we've spoken about, and what actions are required by whom in order to realize a more just set of energy transitions globally and locally. So I am going to end my introduction there, just to remind everyone that the session's being recorded. So if you don't want to be recorded, then contributions, then hold back your contributions, or you can do so in the chat, and we'll make this available afterwards to the same constituency of people who are invited to attend. So I will pass straight on to Christine, who's going to take us through the role of innovation and how it can be catalyzed.
Hi everyone, and thank you, John, for that introduction. So I'm from the School of Finance and Management here at SOAS, but my main area of research, or one of my main areas of research, is innovation and also trying to create income equality across regions. Normally that's subnational, but in this context it is global and between low income and high income countries. So that's the challenge really. Can we solve the climate crisis and also do something to reduce inequality between high income and low income countries? And to get a just transition, we do need to use low and zero carbon technologies. And some of those technologies exist, but they're not diffused. Not everyone's using them. And some of them have yet to be created, and we need to kind of speed up that process. So we need to do the 2 things: speed up the creation of new technologies and speed up diffusion of existing ones. So, for example, to give you an example on that, the hybrid vehicle, which uses half the carbon of a conventional engine, petrol or diesel engine, it's been around for 22 years, but it's hardly diffused. And the same with electric vehicles, not completely zero carbon, but low carbon. They've been around for a long time, but they're not diffused. And the problem with diffusing plug-in vehicles is, of course, you need the charging point. So you kind of need everyone to switch together. So these are quite difficult problems to solve. How can we do it? How can we speed up innovation and create more diffusion of the existing technologies? Well, one method of doing this, or one theory about doing this, is something called the Porter hypothesis, after Michael Porter. And he argued that regulation can play a key role in catalyzing innovation and diffusing innovation, because it acts as a spur to innovation. So how does that work? Well, you set a very clear deadline that from this date onwards, you cannot have, petrol engines, for example, and that if everyone commits to that and binds themselves to that agreement, then what it does is it diffuses innovations more quickly, diffuses technologies more quickly. So if we had that commitment to a hybrid engine, say when it was first introduced in 2000, that by 2005, you can't sell a non-hybrid engine anymore, we would have cut fuel emissions by half, petrol emissions by half from vehicles, and the technology would have diffused very quickly. So that commitment can act as a spur to innovation diffusion. It could also generate better hybrid engines and even better technologies. So the key things that make it work are the deadline and coordination between companies, because one of the things about if you wanted to switch to plug-in vehicles is if everyone does it together, you need to build up this network of plug-in stations. You can also transition completely away from individual vehicles and public transport, and this would be another another mechanism, but it's the deadline that does it. So is this all pie in the sky, you might say? Am I just making this up and it doesn't work? But I just want to share something with you where this really has worked. So I'm going to try and share my screen now. I'll just put it in, well, I can leave it like that. Can you see the graph? This is, I'm going to talk about now two initiatives, the Montreal Protocol, which was to deal with the hole in the ozone layer and to restrict and actually eliminate the use of the worst CFC gases, and the Paris Agreement, which is designed to, the target is set in a different way, not to eliminate carbon. The target is set in terms of limiting the increase in global temperature, average global temperature above the pre-industrial level. So the Montreal Protocol is on the left there, and it was signed in 1987, it was introduced in 1989, it had a target of reducing CFC gases, the worst forms of them that were affecting the ozone layer, by 50% in 10 years. And you can see actually, although companies objected very vociferously to this legislation, they did it in less than they did it in 3 to 5 years. The red line is the rich developed economies under the protocol, and the blue one is the Article 5, or think of them as low income countries. There you can see their use was very low, but it increased. But then as technology was transferred to them with a multilateral fund to pay for that transition and that transfer of technology, they too shared in the decline. And now these worst of the CFC gases have pretty much been eliminated. There are other problems around that, and the protocol is going on. Let's look at what happened under the Paris Agreement. This is set in a completely different way. It's not a target to eliminate carbon. It's a target that is a collective target that we all share to keep the temperature increase on average below, ideally, 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And everyone submits a plan. And this is the interim report on the plan submitted in 2020. Some of them have been since updated. And you can see we're way off the target. And that's because this is not binding. This target is not binding. It's how the agreement was brokered in Paris. It's great to have got the agreement, but you can see the difference between a very clear deadline and this much softer target, which is not specified in terms of carbon, but in terms of temperature, and we're all contributing to that. And the other instrument that if you're in any of the other sessions, I'm sure my colleague Uli would have spoken about it, is finance, that there's a target doubling down on the financial target to give $100 billion a year from 1921 from rich to poor countries to help with this transition, but this target has not been met. So the lessons from this are, we need to have binding targets. Binding targets are much more effective than softer nationally determined contributions, and we need to finance them. So there are lessons, I think, from these two different treaties of the United Nations. The Montreal Protocol is widely regarded as the most successful treaty. It's signed by all member states, and it has been effective. And the Paris Agreement is a work in progress, and it really needs to be stepped up. So I'll stop there in the interest of time. I hope it wasn't too long.
Great, thank you very much, Christine. And we will head straight over to Giuseppina.
Thank you, John. I have also 3 slides, not only one. I hope that is okay. I will share my screen. Can you see the presentation now?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so, well, as you said at the beginning, when we made the introduction of this session, I'm going to talk about renewable energy transitions, equity and justice, and I would like to start with a brief energy transition definition from the International Renewable Energy Agency. Energy transition is a pathway towards transformation of the global energy sector from fossil-based to zero carbon energy, and which means to transition toward a zero carbon society and to achieve the net zero target of carbon neutral society by 2050. And according to the International Renewable Energy Agency, renewable energy and energy efficiency can potentially achieve 90% of the required carbon reduction. So renewable energy transitions are at the core of the transition policies. These transition policies entail a technological shift based on the development of new renewable energy infrastructures which are embedded in specific local, socio-ecological, and economic contexts. So what is important is to take into account some justice questions in this transition, because if we move from a general decarbonization definition of energy transition, which is the decarbonization definition, the main narrative of energy transition, which is based on energy efficiency, to a just transition, we should look at energy transition as complex political processes and look at how energy transitions influence human-environment interactions and ask the following critical questions. One of the questions is justice for whom? Who are the winners and losers of renewable transition? How can we ensure that the costs of the transition are mitigated and the benefits of the transition are equally shared by different segments of the society, most importantly, vulnerable and marginalized people, especially in the global south? And when I talk about vulnerable and marginalized people, I refer to indigenous communities, for example, women, or marginalized communities without energy access in remote and isolated areas, in rural areas, for example. And also it's very important to ask the question, renewable energy for whom? Is this energy produced affordable for the local population where the infrastructure is built, or is the energy produced used in other areas? So what's the development divide between rural and urban settings, for example? This is also important, but also who has access to this, to the electricity produced? It's important that the most vulnerable and marginalized people, the one that really needs to have energy access, they can have access to the information, to the energy that is produced. There is also another question, which is what if this decarbonization narrative is based on dispossession, or is causing dispossession, for example, reduced access of natural resources for the local population. And I say that because there are many studies that have shown that many renewable energy technologies are associated with enclosures, which is appropriation and dispossession of land and other natural resources from local communities. Also exclusions, which means a poor inclusiveness of those affected by energy decisions and unfair decision-making process, but also as they have resulted in environmental degradation and worsening of pre-existing inequalities and vulnerabilities, especially in relation to marginalized communities, as I said before. Another important question is to look at, or aspect of energy transition, is to look at new form of neocolonialism. There is an increasing body of literature looking at carbon offsetting schemes, for example, which include investments in renewable infrastructures as a new form of colonialism, which means, because carbon offsetting schemes are the practice of developed countries in investing in low carbon projects such as renewable energy infrastructures in the global south to meet carbon reduction targets in the global north. This practice is being criticized for its negative impacts on the environment, on the local population, and in some cases, in cases of some specific projects as well, such as, for example, large hydropower dams, they have been criticized in terms of emission reductions, claiming that many of these projects actually are not carbon neutral as they produce greenhouse gas emissions. These are very important questions, and they suggest that to achieve climate justice, energy transitions cannot be interpreted as and analyzed only in terms of technological shifts, economic costs, carbon offsetting potentials, or energy efficiency, but they should be treated as political processes involving a complex interaction with different dimensions and justice aspects. This can be done, for example, looking at renewable energy infrastructure and energy transition and social technical systems by combining the hardware and financial framing with natural, geopolitical, socioeconomic, and political aspects, as well as justice concerns of fair distribution, fair process, and democratization of the decision-making process, taking into consideration local needs and priorities, as well as differentiated vulnerabilities and intersecting inequalities. So this is the end of my presentation. There are many different things in the slide, but these are the main points I wanted to make today.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Giusy, giving us a framework with which to think about a whole range of aspects of the intersection of energy and justice. And I will now pass over to Michael, who's going to talk about the global politics of justice and energy.
Thanks, John. Here, I will also time myself. So hello, everyone. So I do international relations. I'm a lecturer in international relations. And so from an IR perspective, I'm interested in how we can envision and enact just transitions at the global scale. And so rather than just looking within, particular states or regions. And so this has already been touched on by some of the previous speakers, but I'll just say kind of a couple of things on sort of what do we mean by global climate justice and what are some of the issues we need to keep in mind when trying to realize that vision. And so, an obvious way to understand this is addressing the climate crisis in a way that centers unequal responsibility for the crisis. So as most people know, an obvious point, the countries of the global north are vastly responsible for this crisis. So according to one estimate, the countries of the global north, this includes Europe, the UK, the US, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, responsible for roughly 90% of the carbon that has been placed into the atmosphere since the 19th century. And so it's obviously not coincidence that these countries are also by far the richest in terms of per capita income and geopolitical power, because this was developed on the back of fossil fueled development. And so it's a fairly obvious point. This is commonly recognized. It's enshrined in the UNFCCC, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and with the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. But still, despite that, the countries of the global north have still not taken anything like the level of initiative that is necessary to really address this crisis. And so someone mentioned earlier, there's the problem with lack of climate finance for the global south, meeting commitments for the Green Climate Fund, which should have been reached about 100 billion per year at the start of this decade, but that hasn't even been reached yet. And that number is by itself woefully insufficient. But then even looking at the targets being adopted by states in the global north. So even global leaders like the EU and the UK, for example. So they have adopted initiatives. They have enshrined in law that they're committed to meet net zero emissions by 2050. And so this is what the IPCC says is necessary to have a 50-50 chance at the 1.5 degree target that the world economy needs to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And so the EU and the UK have both enshrined this target into law, and so they see themselves as world leaders in driving climate action and the renewable energy transition. And certainly they are world leaders in a large sense. But if we take a global climate justice perspective, then it would really mean that for the whole world to get to net zero by 2050, then the global north, we need to get there much earlier. We need to get there by 2030 or sometime in the 2030s to give the global south, to give other countries who have not historically benefited from fossil fuel development, they deserve, at least another decade, if not more, to be able to use fossil fuels to meet critical development needs. So they should really be getting a huge part of the carbon budget. They should arguably be getting 90% of the remaining carbon budget, which would mean, countries like the UK, the US, Europe, the rest of Europe would need to decarbonize extremely rapidly. And that is, of course, incredibly unrealistic to expect that they will, at least in the current political context, because that would be an incredibly dramatic transformation of economic activity in these countries, really a kind of emergency style mobilization to get to net zero in the 2030s. And so certainly we don't see anything like that happening right now, but really following principles of global climate justice, that is what the global north should be aiming for. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind, because when EU leaders in the UK, when they pat themselves on the back and congratulate themselves on the progress they're making, I mean, it's not that we don't deny that, but we need to take that with a hefty grain of salt, because, you know, the difference between what they're doing and what they really should be doing in accord with these principles. And so I just have a few more seconds, but just a couple other issues that we want to also draw attention to when looking at the global scale. So first is this issue of stranded nations. So people often use this term stranded assets, referring to the risk of basically fossil fuel assets that can't be burned because they need to be compatible with the Paris targets, and so they won't get burned. And so in the same way, we can speak of stranded nations in the sense that states whose revenue is largely reliant on fossil fuel exports, and also many states who have historically been disadvantaged by colonialism and unequal extraction in the global economy. And so in particular, states like Nigeria, Libya, the Republic of Congo, Iraq, very vulnerable to becoming, stranded nations in this sense. And so from a global climate justice perspective, we need to think about how can we design compensation mechanisms, ways so that these states do not become even more poor, more destabilized as a result of the transition. And so things like technology transfers, debt cancellation, unconditional grants, as opposed to the loans that take up, most climate finance going from the global north. This is the kind of thing we need to be thinking about. So that I went over my time, so I will stop there.
Thanks very much, Michael, and some really interesting overlaps with our previous session on finance and some of the tools that are available to create an international climate justice framework for the finance industry and reshape how climate finance flows are designed, not just in terms of their scale and sum. So great, I think we're running nicely on time. I'll try and stick to my time too. I'm going to give us 5 minutes without slides, and then we'll have time for the rest of the session for discussion. So I would like to suggest that we need to disagree about climate justice, and I have the benefit of going last. So I think I first want to suggest that we need to agree to disagree about what is just. So even amongst the group of people who we've had discussing this afternoon, we've had very different ideas of what justice looks like. So to take one example, paying polluters to reduce emissions could be a regressive subsidy, or it could be a progressive inducement, depending on how a person perceives justice. And second, I think we need to recognize that there's no equal public sphere in which we can reach consensus on what justice is. So any deliberative process, any conception of the common good that might come from it, will be shaped by some voices more than others, and some voices are more powerful than others, as we know. So that makes disagreement and power really at the heart of just transitions. And I think that also means that invoking greater participation for just outcomes can only ever be a partial solution, even though it's normally the recourse. So participation can take many forms. Obviously, we heard in the first session that consultation on a policy that has already been formulated will produce very different priorities to something like a climate assembly or a participatory budgeting process, in which the terms of the discussion of participation are actually open to change and definition by a wide group of constituency or stakeholders. So where those terms of inclusions are closed, alternatives are crowded out. So for example, in Canada, the Liberal Democratic government formally recognizes Indigenous land rights, but only so far as they're used to enable continued extraction and transport and fossil fuel from Indigenous lands. So a meaningful process of participation or deliberation in that context would need you to be able to account for the very different worldviews of Indigenous people and fossil fuel interests, governments or corporations, which are normally incompatible in a lot of deliberative processes. So in that context, what should be done with injustice and with justice? And I want to make two very brief points here. The first is the priority of starting with injustice rather than justice. So if we won't all agree on what's just, that doesn't mean that we can't act upon injustice. So put another way, recognizing wrongdoing doesn't necessarily require us to have a consensus on what is right. So for example, agreeing on a conception of climate justice that we all agree on, that defines what is just, is not required in order for us to recognize that it's unjust for the impacts of extreme weather on subsistence farmers in the south, for example. We can agree upon those based on some basics. And this is really the lesson that comes from environmental justice struggles of the past and present, that organizing around the power of rhetoric and discourse and the lived embodied experiences of injustice can be very powerful. So for example, if you had a rather narrow focus on what we should do about fossil fuel jobs and opened that up to consider injustices rooted in communities and places, that we might hear more voices of people who have been harmed by the fossil fuel industries rather than just their current employees. So people in the south at extractive sites, southern economies that have been underdeveloped for decades, or communities in the north who suffer the health impacts of local or water pollution through their proximity to toxic pollutants and fossil fuel infrastructure. And second, I think we should start with the social rather than the technology. So that's something that might seem quite intuitive, but it's actually not normally the starting point for a lot of policy. The priority should be to re-engineer the social organization of technology, not to switch technology or to fuel switch. So that might seem intuitive, but like I say, it doesn't normally happen. And we've seen that in this week with the British government setting higher targets for renewable energy generation, including onshore wind. So they're very aware that onshore wind faces local opposition, and they propose compensatory payments to get local residents to secure their acceptance for it. While the owners of wind power infrastructure are increasingly concentrated among a set of transnational investor-owned utilities. So we don't see the opening up of space for different social organization of the wind power sector. We see a continuation of it. So in this case, you would need to have varieties of capitalism to be open up to debate so that we could consider different models, say, for example, like ones they've used in Denmark, so that that citizens have a stake in the growth of renewable energy sector that can benefit them. So all of this matters because it shapes which aspects of society need to change when we talk about justice, whether we're talking about change that needs to happen amongst individuals, amongst businesses, amongst governments, amongst regulators, amongst financiers. So these different ideas of justice are really invoking different ideas of social change that we need to encounter and really confront in order that we can have debates that really get to the nub of the causes of injustice rather than create ameliorative policies to affect how the injustices should be distributed around a group of people who have suffered them historically. So I'm going to end my presentation there and open up the discussion to the floor. We can hear from other presenters who may like to reflect on what they've heard from others, but it would be great to have a question from the floor first, if anyone has one. And we can have those questions in any way you like, through the chat or through raising your hand or just chipping in. Okay, so if we haven't got any questions, I'll jump in with one of my own and maybe it can spark off some thoughts. So yeah, I had a question for Christine. Christine, you mentioned that the nationally the NDCs were not sufficient because they weren't legally binding, and they hadn't created the same effect that the Montreal Protocol had because of the way that they're orientated towards the necessity for change. Would you say that that is a realistic priority in the international sphere, and is that the priority for creating action at the local level, that we need to have an internationally binding set of binding targets for nations in order to spur the change that we need to see at different levels of the economy and society?
Yeah, question, John. I mean, I think that having the overarching commitment is very important, you know, to limit carbon emissions is very important. And what we've got is something in between. And I can, you know, and we all know why we ended up there, because it was a way of getting agreement and way of getting people to sign up to limiting climate change. But it is a target that's very hard to act upon. It also gives a lot of freedom. Although I do believe that it's better to have a more binding target, although it's got to be different for high income and low income countries and those, you know, the polluters, the people that have created the problem, as Michael said, and as Giuseppina have said, you know, for justice, and the people that are suffering the effects of that, because, you know, these average figures as well for temperature change are very different. They mask huge differences across, well, mainly across the global north and south in terms of their impact. That what is 2 degrees on average is not 2 degrees in many African countries. It's closer to 4 degrees. So there's those issues. But I think the reason that why is that useful to have a binding target? It's useful because it concentrates minds and it does create something that very clear that everyone can aim towards. How you get there, I think there should be a lot of freedom, and it should be locally determined. But having that overarching framework does concentrate minds and get commitment to doing something by a certain date. And I agree with what you were saying, though, very much. It's got to be locally determined, and it's, you know, if you can get the bottom-up thing, but sometimes the top-down approach can generate a lot more bottom-up action. I think the Montreal Protocol, it is an interesting case study because it was so successful. There's lots of other problems with it, by the way, because, you know, they shifted on to other types of gases, and those also have problems, so they're less harmful to the ozone layer. But it did stop the hole in the ozone layer. It was successful in doing that. And why was it successful? Because it did recognise differences between high income and low income countries. It did transfer significant funds from high income to low income countries to transfer technologies. It's hard to know exactly why that was so successful in a way that we seem to not be successful on carbon, but it would be, you know, I think there is scope to learn lessons from it and apply them to carbon.
Yeah, and a comment in the chat from Tom there about maybe issues of complexity of the embeddedness of carbon in the economy, perhaps, and technology available to meet the challenges of CFCs, which might have made it more easy to tackle to implement the Montreal Protocol than to implement the aims of Kyoto Protocol.
Just on that very briefly, I mean, the other ingredient for success in Montreal was that they had very clear ways of measuring, that everyone signed up to, very clear reporting mechanisms. And I agree with Tom, yeah, it's much more difficult on carbon, but we should try and do something in that direction.
Any other comments? There's a question in the chat from Tom for me, but I'm aware that I've spoken quite a bit already. I guess, yeah, examples of action stemming from, or maybe we can, yeah, examples of action stemming from the agreement of injustice, Tom. I guess we're looking at the kind of examples that Giusy gave an introduction to around the expropriation of land, the dispossession of livelihoods and the means of subsistence through various infrastructure projects and fossil fuel extraction. They might be around environmental justice movements, around clean air and water in urban areas in the States where the environmental justice movements really started, but it's a discourse and a frame of reference that's been invoked in translocal struggles all over the world, where there is a sort of community of injustice, if you like, who are identifiably at the raw end of a particular intervention. So Giusy gave the example of forestry projects under the REDD+ program that have very little free prior or informed consent, which we also heard from with Tom in the previous session, in which the financing mechanism really has no scope for accounting for the injustices that are created through the projects, and which creates a sort of a pole or focal point around mobilization around injustice, which can be very powerful in creating not only responses to a set of interventions that create injustice, but around creating deliberation around alternatives to those. So that's what I mean by action stemming from agreement around injustice. So a question from Mark: intergenerational justice hasn't been mentioned, perhaps in terms of available carbon loading to LDCs. I guess maybe that's one for you, Michael. I mean, you mentioned the sort of historical carbon debt or environmental debt that nations have.
Sorry, what was the question?
It's in the chat there. So Mark said intergenerational justice hasn't been mentioned much in this session so far. So maybe that's something you'd like to reflect on in relation to the international relations angle.
Yeah, sorry, for some reason I can't.
Okay, sorry, no, it's because Mark sent that one to me directly.
Gotcha.
He's posted it to
Yeah,
everyone.
it hasn't been intergenerational justice in terms of available carbon loading. Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one, honestly, and clearly, I mean, it's something that the current discipline of economics is very poor at taking account of. I mean, largely in the way it discounts the future, because it assumes that that humans are going to be richer in the future, that the economy is going to continue to grow. It's going to be, 3 times as large. We're going to be 3 times as wealthy by mid-century, and so on and so on. And so, future generations are going to be much better equipped to adapt to whatever climate change does occur. And so it's cheaper, for us to delay mitigation into the future in that sense. And then, of course, that kind of worldview or way of thinking is very flawed in the way, I mean, that it assumes that we're all going to keep getting richer, even if we exceed 2 degrees and get in the vicinity of 3 degrees. And it ignores the fact that economic growth is based on a stable climate, stable ecological conditions. And so it is not at all clear that humans will continue to get richer. And then, of course, there's questions about who will get richer, adaptation for who, and how are those unevenly distributed based on power and access to resources. And so, I mean, I think that simply it's a reason why it's so important to take the 1.5 degree target seriously, and why really all efforts need to be aimed at accelerating emissions reduction to limit temperatures there. And I think that right now that looks very unlikely. Even the 2 degree target looks very unlikely in terms of, I mean, certainly current policies are putting us on pace for 2.9, and things could be even worse with positive feedbacks. And so some kind of crash program to meet the 1.5 degree target, I think that is the best thing that can be done for the purposes of intergenerational justice. That's going to give the best chance for a long-term stable climate and livable future, especially for regions in sub-Saharan Africa, in the Middle East and South Asia that would be most intensely impacted, as well as low-lying island states around the world. These are the states that would be most impacted by a 2 degree rise. And so I think full speed ahead towards 1.5, however that can be done, and obviously countries in the global north taking the initiative there, that is ultimately the most important objective, I think, in terms of intergenerational justice.
So a comment from Tom in the chat. The economic problem is also that our accounting methods heavily discount costs of future impacts and benefits of avoiding them. Either we change our accounting systems or we simply require elements of catastrophic impact in the near term to switch the balance. I don't know if anyone has any expertise on how environments are accounted in economic systems, in economic systems. But as maybe a rhetorical question from Tom, but
yeah.
feel free to
I mean,
answer.
I would agree. I mean, yeah, I'm no expert on environmental accounting systems. I would agree that it's likely going to take catastrophic impacts. That I think that even changing the accounting systems and climate economists are obviously trying to do that. There's a recent paper in Nature that talks about how most estimates of the cost of climate change, or the cost of mitigating climate change tend to vastly underplay, the avoided costs down the line of unmitigated warming. And even those are probably, those are, very problematic in terms of translating lives lost and ways of life lost into terms like GDP or financial loss. That's obviously really problematic and impossible. But even with those accounting changes, I would personally think that that's not going to change the calculus of those in power and the broader public, to galvanize a broader movement. And so I do think it would likely require catastrophic impacts. And I think the Ukraine crisis shows that an energy crisis is perhaps more effective at galvanizing the kind of rapid action that we need. Although right now it's taking the form of all of the above, fossil fuels plus renewables. So whether a similar crisis could in conjunction maybe with climate impacts could solely shift the focus to accelerate renewables, keep fossil fuels in the ground. I think that's our best hope, but yeah, I'm not super optimistic that it will happen.
Giusy, you've done quite a lot of research in the past on sort of project level of observing some of the impacts of environmental injustices and how they play out amongst different members of heterogeneous communities. I wonder if you'd come across any of the ideas, seen in any of those projects, how sort of different priorities and interests of different stakeholders are accounted within project mechanisms. If a community's interest has to be weighed up against the costs or benefits in economic terms of a hydroelectric dam, how does that normally play out in practice? How are community interests weighed against economic benefits or harms? If you had any reflections on how justice can give us a lens on some of those.
Well, in general, if you look at renewable energy infrastructures, not only I think hydropower, but the decision-making process for deciding which alternative or which infrastructure to develop in a specific context, local context, is not based on the inclusion in general of priorities and needs of the local population. So what they do, it's mainly to include them to talk about compensation. So they look at the impacts, especially on land, which is based on private property rights. So if you are an indigenous people living in a rural area and you have access to customary land, you don't have the right, and you lose access to this resource because of the construction of a dam or a wind park or a solar park. You don't have, you are not entitled to receive compensation. So usually it's more the decision-making process and inclusiveness, and these processes of including the local population in decision-making is just to inform them about the compensation they will receive for the losses they had. And not all the losses are compensated. As I said before, access to forest, access to land, access to forest products, they are not considered in the compensation measures, or they're not compensated. These kind of losses are not compensated. So I think I don't have any good examples to talk about today of empowerment and inclusiveness of the local needs and priorities to decide actually the energy futures of certain communities, which is the point, I think, which is very important, that is not done anywhere, I think. So it's not usually the kind of decision is made top down, and then they involve the local population to accept, to present the project, but they don't look at the alternatives, energy alternatives. So the point is how we can, at the beginning, trying to look at different alternatives from local population, for local people, and probably we will have a better transition and a just transition in that case, because the impacts will be less probably for the local population.
Great. Any other questions from the floor or from our speakers?
Maybe I can comment a little bit on intergenerational equity. I think I did some field work and work with indigenous, with local communities in Vietnam. And I can say that the intergenerational equity is much more taken into consideration from local communities. They have an idea of, they want to preserve the environment, not just because they depend on the resources from the environment, but also for future generations in the area where they are. And this is something that is considered important more for local communities than for the institutions or at the national level, or for companies or people making the decisions about the energy transition.
Yeah, I think often in climate debates, the issue of intergenerational equity is often conflated with carbon emissions, essentially, isn't it? It's about whether we can burn fossil fuels today in order to disadvantage or discount the futures of unborn generations in the future. But like you say, there are all of these connections at different scales between how people value their environments for the future generations, and equally for honouring past generations on land in which they've inherited a set of environmental and social relations that they seek to safeguard and to reproduce, and which are under threat through climate catastrophe or through various forms of fossil fuel extraction, for example, on particular sites. So yeah, intergenerational equity is not just about carbon emissions, and it's certainly not just something for international climate negotiations to consider. It's something that happens across multiple scales and in multiple sites, and not just on economic terms, for sure. We've got a question from Roz about carbon offsetting, whether that should be avoided and what actions are required, and also one from Mark at the same time, so take your pick, which you'd like to answer. Are we still making progress in development despite climate change and other stresses on the environment? Mark believes that the term is climate resilient development. Are we making progress on climate resilient development? So anyone want to take up either of those questions?
I'm happy to have a go at the.
Thanks.
I think if you want.
Great. Yes, please.
Yeah, I think that if you do transfer capabilities, to deal with climate change from rich countries to low-income countries, and a lot of that has got to do with education. It's shocking that we just cut our budget for development aid, but a lot of it's not just aid. It's developing education, developing networks of human capital to transfer technologies and help build sustainable, this is in the question, resilient to sustainable development in low-income countries, so they don't have to go through all of the mistakes that we've made, and they can choose their own path. But to do that, we do need to transfer capabilities, and part of that is technology. So it is possible to get a just transition, just focusing in terms of income now, that would help even up inequalities between low income and middle and high income countries through that transfer mechanism, but it needs to be worked out really, really carefully, and it needs a commitment to commitment to doing that. And you need to start from the strengths in those low-income countries, not to impose something from high-income to low-income countries. But I believe it can be done, but it needs careful work to do that. There are examples on regional innovation strategies that are tailored to local needs that can be adapted, I think, to do that.
I could also say something on the offsetting question, just kind of building on what Christine said. I mean, I think that in practice, it's like a nearly impossible. I mean, it's doable in principle, but in practice, like incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to really govern it effectively, to make sure that projects that are receiving or that are seen as offset worthy, that investors can, invest in and then offset their emissions from business operations or whatever else, to be able to really verify that that the carbon is actually, that the amount of carbon is actually being sequestered, that offsets, a given amount of emissions, and to be able to guarantee that that's going to remain sequestered, in the long term. Like there's been reports of forests that companies have purchased offsets for to, plant these forests, and then they've gone up in flames from wildfires. And so there's really no way to be able to verify that, the carbon is going to remain sequestered. And they're also expanding these offset markets for like regenerative agriculture, investing in agricultural practices that conserve carbon in the soil. But again, there's no, even in the best case scenario, if it does sequester a certain amount of carbon, there's no guarantee that that's going to remain in the ground. And these are like relatively best case scenarios. I mean, you'd have to have a very effective verification system that can avoid the kinds of fraud that was rife with the clean development mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol. I mean, some estimates say like the majority of the credits produced under the CDM, the majority of the offsets were not really climate worthy, and it's almost certain that we would have the same problem. But with that said, like I think there is a way, like what Christine was saying, there is a need to have ways to channel resources towards states in the global south and communities who need it. And so if it's possible to design offset markets with very strict both emissions and social justice criteria, and also to make sure, I think a really important thing is to make sure that companies or states, they can only meet a certain amount of their commitments, like maybe 5-10% of their commitments from offsets. Otherwise, there's this risk that they just purchase offsets to meet, say, 50% of their emissions reductions. Like this is what oil companies like Shell are more or less planning, and that basically, you can't have a Paris compatible system if everyone is just buying up offsets to meet most of their reductions. So I think limiting the amount that whether states, city governments, or companies can purchase, limiting it to 5 to 10%, having very strict verification criteria, it would make for, I think they could play a role in that case. But in practice, I think it would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to really make it work.
I could combine a couple of those questions on essentially technology support and offsetting by reflecting on a paper that I wrote about 8 or 9 years ago about the role of technology transfer under the clean development mechanism, which Michael just mentioned, which was an incredibly inefficient tool in order to create the kind of technological capabilities and sharing between companies in the North and South that's required in order to not just diffuse technology, but to build capabilities in technology in the South such that countries are able to gain the knowledge and expertise in order to build from those technologies, to indigenize them within their own infrastructures and firms in order to actually transfer productive capabilities from North to South. And this market mechanism was a an incredibly poor way of doing that. But I wonder if, Christine, you mentioned that there are some examples of how climate innovation has been perhaps created through the international architecture, or some success stories about how productive capabilities have been transferred from north to south, did you?
Not specifically on climate, but on regional innovation strategies, a whole set of policies designed to, they were designed to help lagging regions, subnational regions, catch up with higher income regions. It was a European program, but it can be rolled out to other countries. But the methodology is to go in and look at what is existing in a locality or region, work out its strengths, and try and build something from that that meets certain objectives. And one of them could be obviously climate, limiting climate change and promoting use of clean technologies and phasing out dirty technologies. So that can be done. It's got to engage the whole local community. That's the whole strategy behind it, is to engage the business sector, the government sector, the household sector in the design of those policies. And it is consistent with overarching targets. There is a lot of work's been done on it. I think it could be applied, something I'm looking at now, could be applied to this issue. And there is a sense of urgency, isn't there, to do so?
Yeah, there certainly is a sense of urgency, and hopefully a sense of hope and agency as well, because I think that was one of the things that we were hoping to move towards in this set of sessions this afternoon. And I think we've had some examples of really how we can engage with the politics of low carbon energy transitions in order to shape them in more just ways in this session, and really intersected with some of the ideas that were introduced in the first session around just transformations and financing in the second. All of those sessions were recorded, so if you'd like to watch them back, then you will be able to. We'll make those recordings available in due course. Thank you very much to the speakers in this session, to Christine, to Michael, to Michael, and to Giusy, and to the sessions, and especially to Giusy for organising this set of sessions this afternoon. Thanks very much for your participation, and I'm sure we'll all be interacting sometime in the future soon on these really important topics. So I wish you a good afternoon, and see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, John, and thanks, Jesse.
Yeah, thanks everyone.